Good morning, fifth grade. We're going to start today with chapter 1, lesson 3. And the essential question for this lesson is, how were the native peoples of the Pacific Coast shaped by their surroundings? So let's go ahead and take a look at our lesson outcomes. All right, so lesson outcome is, what am I learning? In this lesson, you're going to use your investigative skills to find out how different groups of Native Americans were affected by their surrounding environments. Why am I learning it? Reading and talking about geographic features of California and the Pacific Northwest and the Arctic and subarctic will help you understand the differences in the cultures of the Native Americans who live there. How will I know that I learned it? You'll be able to identify the relationship between where a group of people lived and the customs and practices of its culture.
What was life like for the early Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest? Here, the summers were cool and the winters were mild and wet. With many trees, plants, rivers, rainforests, and oceanfront land, the Pacific Northwest region was filled with plenty of food and natural resources. The rocky, narrow Pacific coastline provided Native Americans living here with wild plants, berries, and salmon. They also hunted animals such as deer, elk, beaver, and bears. Cedar trees were among the most important natural resources for people in this region. Native Americans used stone axes to cut cedar trees. They hollowed out cedar logs to make canoes to hunt seals and whales in the ocean. Two tribes that settled in the Pacific Northwest are the Tlingit and Kwakiutl. Both of these groups were skilled craft workers. They built cedar plank houses large enough to house several families. They also built traps to catch salmon and used cedar bark and other materials to make baskets and weave colorful clothing. In addition to shelter and clothing, cedar wood was used to make large totem poles. Totem poles are carved logs that are painted with symbols called totems. They were often very tall, measuring 40 to 60 feet or more in height. Totem poles told stories of important family members or celebrated special events. Another way to mark special events was by having a celebration called a potlatch. At the potlatch, people of the tribe would gather around to play music, sing, dance, and feast to mark a special occasion.
All right, so after watching the video, let's go ahead and continue with our reading with Chapter 1, Lesson 3, How are the Native Peoples of the Pacific Coast shaped by their surroundings? A variety of landscapes. Native Americans settled in a number of vastly different natural environments in the American West. Native Americans established settlements in the snowy Arctic regions of Alaska, the forested coasts of Oregon and Washington, and the arid deserts of Southern California. Surviving in each of these climates required very specific skills, and as a result, Native Americans across the American West developed unique ways of life. Ancestors of the Navajo and Apache people may have reached the Pacific Northwest about 5000 BC. Eventually, some of the descendants of these people migrated south, but others remained in the region. The Tlingit people belong to the same language family as Navajo and Apache, meaning the groups share a common ancestor, but their surroundings have caused them to develop a very different way of life. Here is a picture of a hand-woven baskets that were an important tool in Pomo life. All right, and this map here kind of gives us an idea of the Native Americans of Alaska, which would be up here, the Native Americans of the West, which are down here, and then it just kind of shows you which tribes and groups lived in each of those areas. All right, so Native Americans of California. Native Americans of California can be divided into at least 6 distinct cultural regions: the Northwestern, Northeastern, Central, Great Basin, Southern, and Colorado River. Groups in each area share cultural similarities. Some of the peoples living in the Central region, for instance, speak similar languages. The location of each group directly affects their culture and way of life. The Kuwi'a, for example, built irrigation systems to raise the crops in the desert basin in the south, while the Yurok, living along the northern coast, fished for most of their food. The Pomo are part of, the Pomo are part of Central California cultural area. Before encountering Europeans, the Pomo thrived by making use of the plentiful natural resources available in their region. The Pomo collected acorns, fished with nets and traps, and hunted deer, birds, and other small game. Roundhouses made from wood, earth, and grass functioned as homes and gathering places. Basket weaving played a large role in Pomo life traditions. You saw that picture on the previous page. Pomo baskets, often decorated with feathers and shells, are well known around the world for quality among art collectors. Baskets serve a purpose in a number of aspects of Pomo life, including cooking and childcare. Museums collect Pomo baskets as valuable works of art. Farther to the south, before the arrival of European groups in the Central Valley, including the Miwok, built their cultures around the region's resources. In the valley, Miwok hunters stalked deer, elk, and antelope. In the marshes, they set traps for otters and beavers. Forest may have been the most pivotal source in the Miwok way of life. Oak trees provided the Miwok with their staple product, the acorn. Children would shake loose acorns from oak's upper branches, while women collected the fallen acorns in large baskets. The Miwok women ground the acorns into flour to make bread, biscuits, and soup. Southern California's deserts do not have this same wealth of resources. There, groups such as the Kahlua and the Sereno and the Kamahiwavi adapted to the use of the few plants that grow in the desert. The Kahula also developed irrigation systems to raise crops, including corn, squash, beans, and melons. By digging ditches to feed into small lakes, the Kahulua made use of the limited precipitation, meaning limited rain, to sustain a vibrant culture. All right, so this here is a primary source, and it's How the World Grew, which is a Miwok legend. In the beginning, the world was rock. Every year, the rains came and fell on the rock and washed off a little. This made earth. By and by, plants grew on the earth, and their leaves fell and made more earth. Then, pine trees grew, and their needles and cones fell every year, and with other leaves and bark, made more earth and covered more of the rock. If you look closely at the ground in the woods, you will see how the top is leaves and bark, and pine needles and cones, and how a little below the top, these are matted together, and a little deeper are rotting and breaking up into earth. This is the way the world grew, and it is growing still. So this is a translation of a northern Miwok legend, and it's kind of saying, hey, this is how the Miwok said the world was created. The world grew plants and trees. All right, so continuing on, we have Native Americans of the Pacific Northwest. Native peoples of this region reside in communities along the Pacific coast from what is now British Columbia to Northern California. The ocean supplies seafood and plants for the group of Native Americans living in the Pacific Northwest. Long ago, wood from the area's forest allowed these peoples to construct homes, carve canoes and masks, and fashion household items including dishes and spoons. The Pacific Northwest peoples believed that all living things, including plants and animals, had rights that should be respected. They were careful to cut down only as many trees as they needed to continue their way of life. So they're very scarce with their resources. They didn't want to use more than they actually needed. So here we have Chief Seattle, and there's just a quick did you know. It says Chief Seattle was the leader of the Suquamish and Duwamish people who lived in what is now northwestern Washington state. Seattle wanted to work with the European settlers to coexist with the groups of Native Americans living in the area. In 1855, Seattle agreed to give over his people's land to the U.S. government and move to a reservation. European settlers changed the name of their village to Seattle to honor Chief Seattle. When groups of Native Americans tried to take back their land by force, Chief Seattle kept his warriors out of the battle. He thought that facing the much larger force of settlers was not a good idea. He wanted to retain other lands for his people. So Pacific Northwest groups such as the Tlingit carved totem poles as a way of chronicling their clan and family histories. Totem poles are made from long logs that are carved and decorated to represent people or animals. Each totem pole is made up of a series of these symbols called totems. The totems and their order often reflect the stories of the clans and families of a village. Tlingit and Chinook families often marked major life events such as a wedding or a change of leader, with a ceremony known as a potlatch. At a potlatch, guests of the family receive gifts and enjoy feasting and music. The host is responsible for giving and sometimes can offer more than 100 presents at a single potlatch. The host receives respect and standing among the community as a result of his or her wisdom and appropriate generosity. Pacific Northwest peoples still hold potlatches today, and they are an important source of cultural identity for many people who live in the region. The Makah people made their home on the shores of the Pacific Ocean and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Though the Makah hunted many kinds of sea animals, including seals, porpoises, and sea otters, whale hunting held a special place in Makah life. Makah canoes, carrying as many as 60 hunters at a time, was set out in search of whales. After a successful hunt, the Makah gave thanks for their triumph. Every part of a whale was used in different Makah activities. All right, and you can see here the picture featured. It just says this is a modern day potlatch ceremony. That's what that picture is featuring. All right, continuing on to the subarctic peoples. The subarctic region of North America stretches from Alaska on the Pacific Ocean to Newfoundland and Labrador on the Atlantic coast. A northern forest and marshland known as taiga covers large parts of the subarctic. Many subarctic peoples hunted by following the seasonal movements of moose and caribou, and also fished for salmon. Hunters often used bows and arrows or set up traps to capture their prey. To protect from the cold, people made leggings, moccasins, and parkas from animal skins. Some groups set up temporary hunting and fishing camps of lean-to structures with sloped walls for shelter. During the long and snowy winter, some groups built the more permanent structures. The Dag Zianeg in the western subarctic built partially below ground houses from wood and sod. Some subarctic groups along the Pacific coast had permanent villages run by a council of elders, but the groups further inland were organized in smaller bands of family members. All right, so this map here is just showing you some of the peoples of the Arctic and the subarctic. The subarctic region would be all in green, and then the Arctic region would be that of those in purple. So you can see those there. So let's go ahead and move on with the Arctic peoples. Beyond the tree coverings, the tree-covered taiga is a treeless zone of rocky soil and low-growing shrubs called the tundra. For most of the year, the Arctic region is covered in ice and snow. The native peoples of the Arctic, such as the Inuit, Yupik, and the Aleut, adapted to the extreme cold, making clothes from caribou furs and other animal hides. The winters are severe, with only a few hours of sunlight per day. During this time, many Arctic peoples constructed below ground houses or snowblock homes called igloos. They hunted seal, walruses, and whales along the coast. Many Inuit hunted with long spears called harpoons. So, this picture here is kind of depicting an underground home. So, it says some Daxian, Aleut, and Inuit families lived in partially below ground homes. Their brief summers bring with them very long days of sunlight in which streams of water from snowmelt attract migratory animals such as caribou and musk oxen. These animals were the primary hunting targets of Arctic peoples in the summer. Among some Inuit, the senior male was considered the clan chief. The chief of the strongest clan was the village chief. Some groups had no chief. Let's look at this then and now, the Inuit economy. The early Inuit did not exchange money for goods and services. Instead, they produced their own food, clothing, and other necessities. Because clan members had different skills, sharing and cooperation were essential for the early Inuits' way of life. Sharing is still a key element of Inuit society, but many Inuit today take part in a wage economy. An Inuit person might earn income from working for the local government or through some other profession. Hunting of caribou and seal still occurs, but growing industries include tourism and real estate. Some Inuit earn money from selling sculptures, carvings, and prints. All right, so that brings us to the end of lesson 3. Last question to answer for now is going to be the stop and check here. So go ahead and type your answer into the answer box here. It says, how did climate and wildlife affect the daily lives of Arctic and subarctic peoples? All right, you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all tomorrow.